Chapter 9 of The Madman and the Pirate. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read and recorded by Betsy Bush in Marquette, Michigan, August 2007. The Madman and the Pirate by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 9. Who shall tell, or who shall understand, the thoughts of Richard Roscoe, the ex-pirate, as he wandered lost, yet regardless, in this dismal swamp? The human spirit is essentially galvanic. It jumps like a grasshopper, bounds like a kangaroo. The greatest of men can only restrain it in a slight degree. The small men either have exasperating trouble with it, or make no attempt to curb it at all. It is a rebellious spirit. The best of books tells us that "greater is he that ruleth it than he that taketh a city." Think of that, youngster, whoever you are, who readeth this. Think of the conquerors of the world. Think of the great Alexander, whose might was so tremendous that he subjugated kingdoms and spent his life in doing little else. Think of Napoleon the Great, whose armies ravaged Europe from the Atlantic to Asia, who even began, though he failed to finish, the conquest of Africa, who made kings as you might make pasteboard men, and filled the civilized world with fear as well as with blood and graves, all for his own glorification. Think of these and other great men, and reflect that it is written, "He who rules his own spirit is greater than they." Yes, the human spirit is difficult to deal with, and uncomfortably explosive. At least, so Richard Roscoe found it when, towards the close of the day on which his enemy chased him into the dismal swamp, he sat down on a gnarled root and began to reflect. His spirit jumped almost out of him with contempt when he thought that for the first time in his life he had fled in abject terror from the face of man. He could not conceal that from himself, despite the excuse suggested by pride, that he had half believed Zeppa to be an apparition. What, even, if that were true? Had he not boastfully said more than once that he would defy the foul fiend himself if he should attempt to thwart him? Then his spirit bounded into a region of disappointed rage when he thought of the lost opportunity of stabbing his enemy to the heart. After that, unbidden, and in spite of him, it dropped into an abyss of something like fierce despair when he recalled the past, surveyed the present, and forecast the future. Truly, if hell ever does begin to men on earth, it began that day to the pirate, as he sat in the twilight on the gnarled root, with one of his feet dangling in the slimy water, his hands clasped so tight that the knuckles stood out white, and his eyes gazing upwards with an expression that seemed the very embodiment of woe. Then his spirit lost its spring, and he began to crawl, in memory, on the shores of other days. He thought of the days when, comparatively innocent, he rambled on the sunny hills of old England, played and did mischief with comrades, formed friendships and fought battles, and knew what it was to experience good impulses, understood the joy of giving way to these, as well as the depression consequent on resisting them, and recalled the time when he regarded his mother as the supreme judge in every case of difficulty, the only comforter in every time of sorrow. At this point his spirit grovelled like a crushed worm in the stagnant pool of his despair, for he had no hope. He had sinned every opportunity away. He had defied God and man, and nothing was left to him, apparently, save a fearful looking-for of judgment. As he bent over the pool he saw his own distorted visage dimly reflected therein, and the thought occurred, why not end it all at once? 5 minutes at the utmost, and all will be over. The pirate was a physically brave man beyond his fellows. He had courage to carry the idea into effect, but after death the judgment. Where had he heard those words? They were strange to him, but they were not new. Those who are trained in the knowledge of God's word are not, as a general rule, moved in an extraordinary degree by quotations from it. It is often otherwise with those who have had little of it instilled into them in youth and none in later years. That which may seem to be a Christian but a familiar part of the old story sometimes becomes to hundreds and thousands of human beings a startling revelation. It was so to the pirate on this occasion. The idea of judgment took such a hold of him that he shrank from death with far more fear than he ever had, with courage, faced it in days gone by. Trembling, terrified, abject, he sat there, incapable of consecutive thought or intelligent action. At last the gloom which had been slowly deepening over the swamp sank into absolute blackness, and the chills of night, which were particularly sharp in such places, began to tell upon him. But he did not dare to move, lest he should fall into the swamp. Slowly he extended himself on the root, wound his arms and fingers convulsively among leaves and branches, and held on like a drowning man. An ague fit seemed to have seized him, for he trembled violently in every limb, and as his exhausted spirit was about to lose itself in sleep, or, as it seemed to him, in death, he gave vent to a subdued cry: "God be merciful to me, a sinner!" Rest, such as it was, refreshed the pirate, and when the gray dawn, struggling through the dense foliage, awoke him, he rose up with a feeling of submissiveness which seemed, somehow, to restore his energy. He was without purpose, however, for he knew nothing of his surroundings, and of course could form no idea of what was best to be done. In these circumstances he rose with a strange sensation of helplessness, and wandered straight before him. And oh, how beautiful were the scenes presented to his vision! Everything in this world is relative. That which is hideous at one time is lovely at another. In the night, the evening, or at the gray dawn, the swamp was indeed dismal in the extreme, but when the morning advanced towards noon all that was changed, as if magically, by the action of the sun. Black repulsive waters reflected patches of the bright blue sky, and every leaf and spray and parasite and tendril that grew in the world above was faithfully mirrored in the world below. Vistas of gnarled roots and graceful stems and drooping boughs were seen on right and left, before and behind, extending as if into infinite space, while innumerable insects, engaged in the business of their brief existence, were filling the region with miniature melodies. But Richard Rosco saw it not. At least it made no sensible impression on him. His mental retina was capable of receiving only two pictures: the concentrated accumulation of past sin, the terrible anticipation of future retribution. Between these two, present danger and suffering were well nigh forgotten. Towards noon, however, the sense of hunger began to oppress him. He allayed it with a few wild berries. Then fatigue began to tell, for walking from root to root, sometimes on short stretches of solid land, sometimes over soft mud, often knee-deep in water, was very exhausting. At last he came to what appeared to be the end of the swamp, and here he discovered a small patch of cultivated ground. The discovery awoke him to the necessity of caution, but he was awakened too late, for already had one of the Ratuian natives observed him advancing out of the swamp. Instantly he gave the alarm that a white face was approaching. Of course the appearance of one suggested a scout, and the speedy approach of a host. Horrified to see a supposed enemy come from a region which they had hitherto deemed their sure refuge, the few natives who dwelt there flew to arms and ran to meet the advancing foe. The pirate was not just then in a mood to resist. He had no weapon and no spirit left. He therefore suffered himself to be taken prisoner without a struggle, satisfied apparently to know that the madman was not one of those into whose hands he had fallen. Great was the rejoicing among the Ratuans when the prisoner was brought in, for they were still smarting under the humiliation of their defeat, and knew well that their discomfiture had been largely owing to the influence of white faces. True, they did not fall into the mistake of supposing that Rosco was the awful giant who had chased and belaboured them so unmercifully with a long stake,